Maria Valtorta's vision of Jesus' ascent to Calvary is long. So I shan't read the whole vision. I just read the beginning of the process. The two robbers arrive, each surrounded by a decury of soldiers. It is time to go. Longinus gives the last instructions. Longinus is the commanding officer of this whole process. A century is set out in two lines, at about 3 meters from each other, and moves thus into the square, where another century has formed a square barrier to drive the crowd back, so that it may not obstruct the procession. In the little square, there are already some mounted soldiers. A cavalry decury with a young non-commissioned officer who commands it and has the ensign. A foot soldier is holding the bridle of the centurion's black horse. Longinus mounts and goes to his place, about 2 meters in front of the 11 mounted soldiers. The crosses are brought. Those of the two robbers are shorter. Jesus's is much longer. I say that the vertical stake is not less than 4 meters long. I see that it is already assembled when they bring it. With regard to this matter, I read, when I used to read, that is years ago, that the cross was assembled on the top of Golgotha, and that along the way, the condemned men carried only the 2 poles bundled together on their shoulders. Everything is possible, but I see a true cross, well formed, solid, perfectly mortised at the crossing of the 2 arms, and well reinforced with nails and screw bolts at the junction. And in fact, if one considers that it was destined to support a substantial weight, such as the body of a grown-up person, and also had to sustain it in its last convulsions, one understands that it could not be assembled there and then on the narrow, uncomfortable top of Calvary. So just interject there. Small interesting point for critics of Maria Valtorta's visions. They say, oh, she refers to like a screwdriver at least once. But she doesn't actually. She refers to what she says, what looked like a screwdriver to her. This is in the workshop, I think, of St. Joseph, when Jesus is a child. I mention that because, and the critics mention that because there were no screws, or no screws used in woodworking at that time. They were invented later. But as I say, the important point is that she never said she saw a screwdriver. She said she saw something looking like a screwdriver. And it's natural for us to see what we don't understand and describe it as similar to something we do understand. And when it mentioned here screw bolts at the junction of the cross as reinforcements for the 2 cross pieces, they wouldn't be screw bolts. And of course you wouldn't see them, the screw part, which would be buried inside the wood, but she assumed they would be screw bolts. So that is something the critics haven't picked up upon, as far as I'm aware. They alleged the reference to screw bolts. Furthermore, as I was mentioning in the vision which I described of Jesus being scourged at the pillar, we look at how the film industry has looked at things. In the scourging at the pillar, Jesus, in, say, Mel Gibson's The Excellent Passion of the Christ, but which is drawing from the visions of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, or Venerable Anne Catherine Emmerich, if she's not blessed already, and deservedly so. But her visions were distorted by a man called Clemens Brentano, who was the one who came to record those visions, the great German romantic poet of the early 19th century. He distorted them perhaps out of good intent, but had a negative effect upon the value of the visions. And there is Jesus described as, I think, being attached to a low pillar when the scourging takes place, which differs from Maria Valtorta's vision that Jesus is hanging on a section which is protruding from a long pillar, and so he's fully upright, and that would seem to conform well with the scourging on the Shroud of Turin. But just here, it reminded me that when we see the film Jesus of Nazareth, the 1978 Franco Zeffirelli production, Jesus is carrying just the crossbeam, and the others, the thieves, are carrying the crossbeam too, on the understanding, the belief at that time that it would be too difficult, it would be too heavy to carry the full cross. But Maria Valtorta is writing back in the 1940s, she's saying that actually all the parts were understood then to have been carried by the thieves and by Jesus. So that's another theory about what happened. But she's simply saying, as she says, she sees what she sees and describes what she sees. And that shows her honesty in her visions. And they're not mediated by another person, as were unfortunately those of Anne Catherine Emmerich, who, because of her illness and because of the circumstances of early 19th century Germany, she couldn't record them herself. But these are simply recorded from the visions directly by Maria Valtorta into her notebooks. So just resuming this vision of Jesus' carrying of the cross. Before giving the cross to Jesus, they tie the board with the inscription, Jesus Nazarene, King of the Jews, round his neck. And the rope that holds it gets entangled with the crown of thorns, which is moved and scratches where it is not already scratched, and pierces new parts, causing fresh pain and making fresh blood spout. The people laugh with sadistic joy. They abuse and curse. They are now ready, and Longinus gives the order to march. He says, first the Nazarene, behind him the two robbers, a decury around each of them, the other 7 decuries positioned on the flank as reinforcements, and the soldier who allows the condemned men to be wounded mortally will be held responsible. Jesus comes down the 3 steps that from the lobby take one into the square, and it is immediately clear that Jesus is in an extremely weak condition. He staggers, coming down the 3 steps, hampered by the cross weighing on his shoulder, all covered with sores, by the board of the inscription that sways in front of him, cutting into his neck, by the oscillations caused to the body by the long stake of the cross, which bounces on the steps and on the uneven ground. The Jews laugh, seeing him stagger along like a drunk man, and they shout to the soldiers, "Push him, make him fall, in the dust, the blasphemer." But the soldiers do only what they have to do. That is, they order the condemned one to stay in the middle of the road and walk. Longinus spurs his horse, and the procession begins to move slowly. And Longinus would also like to make haste, taking the shortest route to Golgotha, because he is not sure of the resistance of the condemned one. But the unrestrained mob, and it is even an honour to call it so, does not want that. Those who are more cunning have already run ahead to the crossroads where the road forks, going towards the walls along one way and towards the town along the other. And they riot, shouting when they see Longinus try to take the way towards the walls. You must not do that. You must not. It is not legal. The law prescribes that condemned men are to be seen in the town where they sinned. The Jews at the rear of the procession realise that at the front they're trying to defraud them of a right, and they join their shouts to those of their colleagues. For the sake of peace, Longinus turns along the way that leads towards the town and goes a short distance along it, but he beckons to a decurion to approach him. I say decurion because he is the non-commissioned officer, but perhaps he is what we would call an orderly officer. And he says something to him in a low voice. This man trots back, and as he meets each decury commander, he conveys the order. He then goes back to Longinus to inform him that it has been done. And finally, he goes to the place where he was previously, in the line behind Longinus. Jesus proceeds, panting. Each hole in the ground is a trap for his staggering feet, a torture for his shoulders covered with wounds, and for his head crowned with thorns. Also, because the sun, which is exceedingly warm, although now and again it hides behind a leaden awning of clouds, shines perpendicular on it. So even if it is concealed, it still burns. Jesus is congested with fatigue, fever, and heat. I think that the light and the howling must also be a torture for him. And if he cannot stop his ears in order not to hear so much coarse shouting, he half closes his eyes so as not to see the road dazzling in the sunshine. But he must also reopen them, because he stumbles over stones and holes, and each stumble is painful as it jerks the cross, which knocks against the crown, which rubs against the wounded shoulder, widening the sores and increasing the pain. The Jews cannot hit him directly any longer, but odd stones and blows with cudgels still strike him. The former, particularly in the little squares crowded with people. The latter, instead at bends along the narrow streets with frequent steps going up or down, at times one, at times three, at times more, because of the continuous variations of the ground. The procession is compelled to slow down at such places. And there is always some volunteer who challenges the Roman lances, if only to add a finishing touch to the masterpiece of torture that Jesus is by now. The soldiers defend him as best they can, but they strike him as well while trying to defend him, because the long lances waved about in such narrow spaces knock against him and make him stumble. Now, I'll stop there for a moment and just let you know, now you're going to find out what all that whispering between the St. Longinus and the decury, which was transmitted to the other decuries along the line, was all about. I'll continue the narrative. But upon arriving at a certain spot, the soldiers make a perfect manoeuvre, and notwithstanding shouts and threats, the procession deviates abruptly along a street that goes directly towards the walls, downhill, a good shortcut to the place of the execution. Jesus is panting more and more. Perspiration is streaming down his face, together with the blood that trickles from the wounds of the crown of thorns. And dust sticks to his wet face, leaving queer stains on it, because the wind is also blowing now. Continual gusts at long intervals, during which the dust falls, after being raised in whirlwinds by each gust, and is blown into eyes and throats. Many people have already assembled at the judicial gate, that is, those who providently and in good time have chosen a good place to see. But shortly before arriving there, Jesus almost falls. Only the quick intervention of a soldier, on whom he almost falls, prevents him from falling to the ground. The rabble laugh and shout, "Leave him." He used to say to everybody, "Rise." Let him rise now. Beyond the gate, there's a stream and a little bridge. Walking on the uneven boards is a new fatigue for Jesus, as the long stake of the cross bounces on them even more violently. And there is a new mine of projectiles for the Jews. The stones of the stream fly and hit the poor martyr. The ascent to Calvary begins. A barren road, without the least shade, paved with uneven stones, that goes straight up the hill.